Okay. So, episode 3, technically speaking. With me right now is the father of sales engineering, Mr. John Kerr. Hello, John. How's it going?
It's absolutely fantastic. Great to be with you folks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. So, just for the viewers and the listeners right now who don't that might not know who you are, can you just introduce yourself? Just who you are, what you do, some notable accomplishments, some things that you're proud of doing.
Oh, sure. So my name is John Kerr. I am the author and managing director of a company called Mastering Technical Sales. And my company exists solely to really improve the profession of pre-sales engineers, to use the generic term, all across the world. So we deliver what we call professional skills training, which is teaching sales engineers how to present and demo and communicate most effectively, both with a technical and with a business audience. The company got started, like 20 years ago, when I originally wrote the very first edition of the book, and we'll probably get to that Genesis story a little later. And we've been going ever since. And I had no idea that just writing a book out of basically frustration 20 years ago would now turn into a global business delivering 20 classes in half a dozen different languages. So it's kind of humbling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess kind of basing off that point, you're the foremost, probably the best person to talk about this subject, but what would you define like sales engineering as, if you could give it a brief definition?
The way I explain it to people at cocktail parties, right? Because we have the cocktail party problem.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
You go to a party, they say, "What do you do?" So I'm a sales engineer, and they zone out and say, "I need to top up my glass of wine." So I normally say, so think about a big tech company like IBM or Cisco or Oracle, and they have a glad-handing sales rep who comes and sells information technology, and they take you out and they buy you a nice steak and red wine and promise you things. Then there's always a technical person who comes along who actually has to explain how it works and demonstrate it, right? That's what a sales engineer is. It's basically the technical conscience of the sales force. So that's who we are and what we do.
Okay.
Now that you've defined what sales engineering is for you, I want to ask the first question that popped up in my mind when I knew you were coming on this podcast is why? Why sales engineering? Why did you choose it as a career path?
Oh, it chose me, which is probably the answer you'll get from 90% of people who practice in the industry right now.
I see.
I fell into it, and I'll date myself here, 1984. I mean, so, more than 35 years ago, a vendor was selling technology. I was an engineer, chemical engineer. So go Chem Eng.
Me and Hassan are both chemical engineers.
All three of us here are chemical engineers.
Yes. Who by the way, of all engineers, chemical engineers make the best sales engineers in transition, closely followed by mechanical engineers, I should add. And then civ eng and electrical engineering is like,
and the rest.
and the rest. Who cares about the rest, right? So a vendor was coming into the oil refinery where I worked. I was a chemical engineer working for Esso Petroleum over in the UK, and they were coming in selling technology. And I kind of picked it up, and it was my job to be almost the internal salesperson, explaining how that technology would be of use to the engineers who are on the refinery, to the field technicians and everywhere else. And both the salesperson and the pre-sales engineer from the vendor said, "Hey, you're pretty good at explaining technical things to non-technical people. Do you want a job?" And I said, "Yeah, why not?" And my wife, Allison, is a Yankee girl, right? She's my Yankee sweetheart. So we'd been living in England for 2 or 3 years, and it was an American company. I said, "Yes, I'd love to have a job with you, but only if I can get a job back in the US."
Right.
Allison wants to go home.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's how I got started. I turned up August 1984 in Princeton, New Jersey, my first day as a sales engineer. So
right in the perfect Bruce Springsteen time frame.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, from that, I actually want to go maybe a bit before your sales engineering experience. So I'm just looking here. It says you graduated Imperial College in 1979. Did you always know, going in, that you wanted to be an engineer? Was that sort of what you were always lured towards, or is that?
Well, so I was the very first person in the generation of my family to ever go to university. I mean,
Okay.
no one, if you trace back on either of my parents' side, had ever gone to uni before. So that was kind of just a dream of mine to actually do that. I was a little bit of the technical geek, although I was pretty good at sports as well. So that kept me out of severe trouble. I was really good at math, physics, and chemistry.
Right.
But I didn't want to be a physicist, or I didn't want to go into chemistry. And I was pretty good, applying technology and applying engineering. So a career advisor said, "John, you should be an engineer." And without too much of a thought, I said, "Yeah, sure." And I fortunately managed to get into Imperial. Spent 3 years there, which was an awesome experience. Both learning engineering and being in cosmopolitan London for 3 years. And kind of came out of it with a chem eng degree and went to work for ESSO.
Cool, really cool.
That's super interesting. Honestly, like it just seems that you have everything set up for you. Like my impression is that you've always had a plan. Is that true?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I kind of had a plan. I mean, I'm the classic poor kid from the wrong side of the railway track, so I always had a little chip on my shoulder, and that's always driven me to do things. But in terms of did I have a plan to be, almost an entrepreneur and be an author and running my own business and everything else? I don't know if I sat down and thought that's what I wanted to do when I was, 16, 18, 21, 25. I just keep kind of falling into these things. So I've been really fortunate. I mean, there's no question about it. And I'm grateful for that every morning that I wake up. I think I truly have one of the best jobs in the world, and I have had for decades. And that's kind of one of the cool things about this job is, if you love it, you love it. And there's just so many things and so many experiences it brings to you, but it satisfies everything.
So you can say it's like a passion to you right now. Can I say it safely?
Oh, you absolutely can.
Oh, okay.
As I say, I wake up excited every morning that I get to do this job, and I get to talk to sales engineers all over the world, who are all doing their thing. I get exposed to new technologies as we bring new clients into the business. I mean, what more could I ask for, right? I mean, on the job side, and then on the personal side, and we got this pandemic going on, but I'm grateful that every morning I wake up and we've got food on the table and a roof over our heads and money in the bank and oxygen in our lungs. I mean, how can you want more than that, really?
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for us, like, and for me being in my early 20s, I can kind of, that's like a concern I can relate to a little bit, because I kind of look at my years after university and say, okay, well, like, what the heck am I going to do after I've graduated? Because it doesn't seem very clear. It doesn't seem evident, like the path that I'm going to take. And it's really cool that, and we've spoken to Himanshu before, but he brought this sort of new field that I never heard of before. And I guess if I could make a question out of this, it's kind of like, I've heard that breaking into the sales engineering field is really hard. Like I've heard that it's more of a mid-career sort of, you find yourself in sales engineering, but how would you think I could get myself into sales engineering, like right out of university? Because I've heard from different people that it might, like, you need like experience first.
It's the classic rule that if you don't ask, you don't get.
Right.
So 20 years ago, I would definitely agree that yes, it was more of a midlife career, or at least late 20s, early 30s entry. That's not the case now. I mean, there's approximately 600,000 sales engineers in the world right now. I mean, give or take 20%, how I define them.
Right.
That number's growing at like 8% clip a year.
Okay.
And there's a worldwide shortage of sales engineers.
Right.
So there are companies all over the world who are desperate for sales engineers. There's only a limited market where if you work for, if you're at Oracle, you go steal from Salesforce. If you're at Google, you go, not steal, I mean, you go recruit from Amazon and Red Hat, whatever else. So now many companies are turning and they're looking at, how can I bring on young sales engineers? So they have an NCG program, a new college graduate program.
Okay.
And there's a pretty heavy intake now into both classic engineering companies like the Cranes, the Timkins of the world, as well as tech companies. So every tech company now has one of these intake programs to turn, folks like yourself into a sales engineer. or maybe a salesperson, or maybe product marketing. So they'll help you do that. So it's nowhere near as hard as it was, a decade or two ago.
Absolutely.
In fact, there's a demand. So if you go look for it, they will find you. And
wow.
if you have some modicum of ability, and you have the attitude is the most important thing.
Right.
It's nowhere near as hard as you're making out to get into the profession now.
Okay.
But
awesome.
Do you think there's like a demand currently? Like obviously I know the demand's growing, but do you think the current shortage in supply, if you want me to phrase it, would be because it's less advertised than more conventional engineering jobs like process engineering or anything more related to like hands-on in the field?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, sales engineering is probably one of the best kept secret jobs ever, right? and it has been since, some random guy at IBM invented it 55, 60 years ago, which is kind of the cool thing about it. And if you look, I mean, I've hired probably close to 1,000 sales engineers, when I was a hiring manager at different jobs. And the backgrounds were stunning. I mean, there was classic engineers, what I call hard engineers.
Right.
There were people with backgrounds in information technology. I did once literally hire a rocket scientist. I also hired a Shakespearean scholar. I hired people with backgrounds in sociology, psychology, history, English. I mean, you name it.
Wow.
The key things are: can you communicate? Do you have a somewhat logical brain? Do you like people?
Yeah.
And again, do you have the attitude? I mean, do you have that engineering bent where you want to solve problems and help people?
Right.
And if you want to solve problems and help people and be in front of people, that's, to go back to what you asked me 15 minutes ago, that's another definition of a sales engineer, right?
Right. And I guess it's funny you mentioned like the best kept secret is sales engineering. I guess that's kind of what went into you deciding to actually write like a book about it, is to kind of bring that secret to light. I wanted to know like what went into the process of writing your book, Mastering Technical Sales, and like how hard was that? Did you learn anything along the way?
Oh, learned tons of things,
Yeah.
which is kind of another exciting thing about the job. So I'd been in sales engineering for like more than 15 years. So I've been everything from the individual contributor, right, up at 4 o'clock in the morning in my hotel room trying to get my demo to work,
right.
when the rep is in the room next to me fast asleep, to being a VP of a technical pre-sales organization of a couple hundred people. But we get to the year 2000, and I'm sitting in a windowless ballroom in Georgia, Atlanta actually.
Okay.
Going through my 4th sales process training of my career. So whatever it was, solution selling, spin selling, customer-centric selling.
Right, try not to fall asleep.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a week long. So it's Friday lunchtime, and my brain is numb, my butt is numb. And I turned to one of my direct managers sitting next to me, this lady worked for me, and said, "Why are we here? Now, this is the 5th time we've gone through this.
Right.
It's 5 days of training. Only a day and a half of it is relevant to us, and we can absorb it 3 times faster than most of these sales guys."
Yeah.
And she just turned and looked at me and said, "If you're so smart, why don't you write a book about it?" And that was literally the genesis of the book. And then I left the meeting. I got together with Aaron Bolig, who is my original collaborator on the initial book, and we sat down, spec'd it out. I had some contacts in the publishing industry because I had written some articles before in all kinds of places. So I utilized those, and that's how we got into print in 2001 with the very first edition of the main book.
Yeah.
So your main idea behind that book was just to teach the newer generation about things you wished you knew?
Yeah. It was like, why is there no professional skills training available for sales engineers? I mean, you could go to Toastmasters and they give you some basic presentation training, right? And that was good. And you could go to, negotiation training or sales process training, but none of it is directed to people who had this technical engineering background. It was all for salespeople. So let's write down best practices. and then we'll share our toys, because that's what sales engineers do, right? We share. And that's how we got started. I never envisioned it's going to turn into a business. I just thought, someone's got to write a book about it. Why not me?
Yeah. Well, and so how did it actually go from being a book and then like a second edition of a book and then turning into an actual business? How did that whole thing even happen?
So the original book came out in 2001. It took us like 10 months to write it and get it published and everything else. And then I went back in, and that's right when .com went .crash. Right? So it was not a good time to start up a business. So I went back into the corporate world and worked for a couple of large tech companies running their SE organizations. But started building out training from the book. So basically, I would take a chapter, delivering presentations or whiteboarding, and monetize it and turn it into a training class. And then 2008, the second edition came out. And at that point, I said, okay, it's time to start the business up.
Right.
So in cooperation with somebody I was working for at the time, we slowly started up the business. And then about 10 years ago, it just lit up and took off. So what was 2 or 3 classes now has morphed into 15 or 20.
Right.
I have business partners out in Singapore who represent me in APAC. And we deliver classes now in Japanese, Korean, Mandarin, English and American, I joke, and Spanish. So yeah, it's just turned into this classes that just keeps gathering momentum. It's again, it's amazing. I mean, it stuns me every morning I get up and think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable to me, like listening to how far you've come, honestly.
Yeah.
Like it truly just show that if you're really passionate about something, you can, like, the sky's the limit, basically.
It is. And if you dial back 10, 15 years ago, there were very few of us who specialized in pre-sales. I mean, there's myself, there's a fella, Peter Cohan, who wrote a book called Great Demo. Peter's still around, and we work pretty well together. And that was it. I mean, there really was nobody else.
Right.
And now the last 4 or 5 years, there's been folks like yourself, there's a pre-sales collective, there's a National Society of Sales Engineers. Sales engineering is actually being taught, even if it's just an optional module now, in a number of sales and marketing and engineering classes in universities and colleges all over the world.
Yeah.
And that's all new in the last 5 years. So it's tremendous now. Just the uptake and the way the profession is finally starting to get some recognition.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's kind of not like a relief, but kind of like a yes, we're finally in the forefront.
Yes, a little fist pump, right? Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
I want to ask you a question, if you don't mind. It's like something that I always read, that I first saw in your book, and that I saw later on in job applications, but there's just something I don't understand. I'm still new to the field, so I'm still trying to understand, but I want to know what the difference is between a pre-sales engineer and a sales engineer.
Absolutely none.
Oh, really? Okay. So there is no difference.
It is, there are over 40 different job titles for what we do.
Right.
So the sales engineers, solution architects, customer engineers, systems engineer. I mean, you name it. But they all fundamentally do the same thing. We just have different titles, which is kind of frustrating because a sales rep is a sales rep, right? And they're account executives or whatever, but that's what they are. So pre-sales is the generic kind of internal term that we use to describe ourselves. Sales engineer is the most common job title, which probably a third, 40% of companies use, but there's all these other job titles as well. But they're fundamentally the same thing.
I was kind of wondering if it had anything to do with like the, like when you're bringing a product to the market, like where in the sort of totem pole the sales engineer fits. And it's what I find really cool about it is how they seem to have a handle on both like the technical side. So they're speaking with the design engineers, but then they're also going to the market and speaking to like the end users. And I find that sort of share between the two is really interesting.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. I often say that sales engineers are the oil that keeps the engine of sales running.
Right.
And in smaller companies, they're the oil that keeps the entire company running.
Okay.
Because SEs are kind of the organization of last resort.
Right.
Particularly in smaller companies, if something needs to be done to make the customer happy or to get the deal, and no one else is doing it, it's the SE team that will do it because, again, we're problem solvers and we're pleasers.
Right.
Which which sometimes leads to bad behavior on the part of other parts of the organization. But that's what we do, right? And it's actually one of the the cool and the interesting parts of the
yeah, definitely trying to fit all of the knowledge that you have and try to fit solutions with what you know exists. And
it is, and that's the satisfaction. So Hassan, just to finish off your question, it's really just designed to confuse you. There's just all these titles, and they're fundamentally the same. An architect might do a little bit more higher level design than quote a customer engineer or something, but basically it's the same job role.
Well, if it was designed to confuse us, it sure worked for me.
Okay, there you go.
That's for sure.
Job done. Yeah,
exactly. It's just that the way you're describing a sales engineer is like, it's very different from like other people's opinions. Like, I've heard this multiple times, and I remember I first heard it at the beginning of like last year, where I was talking to someone also in sales, and they were telling me is like, there's this public perception of salespeople being these money greedy people who just want to steal your money. And it's like how they're portrayed every single like everywhere. Like, I just want to know, what are your thoughts on that?
The idea, particularly of an enterprise software or hardware salesperson being equivalent to a secondhand car salesperson is just not true. It is a profession, and if you've never been a salesperson, I actually have been for a couple of years, and technically I am now to some degree, it's really hard work, and you don't see all the. It's like the iceberg. You don't see all the things that are going on under the water in terms of building relationships and everything else that go on to make a salesperson successful. And there are many, many salespeople who've got long time relationships with senior people in their clients just because they have become their trusted advisors. Now, do the customers still understand that the rep is there in their office to sell them something? Absolutely. That's the caveat that goes with them. And that's maybe where a sales engineer is a little different, because reps are predominantly there to sell you something and engineers are there to help you. But if you think of the salesperson and the sales engineer as a team, which is how they operate best, it's almost like a marriage, and they'll work together, and sometimes they go on calls together, sometimes they'll do things separately. And on the customer side, because I've been on the customer side, if you see one of these finely tuned teams of a rep and SE working together, it's quite magical.
Okay, well, and even kind of to go with Hassan's point, I would imagine that, like, if money is your driving factor, which I would assume it works for a lot of people, but I don't think you would find the success that like you might have found, for example, if money was your only like driving factor to go through sales. I feel like you'd have to have some sort of passion for the actual technology behind it, or for finding solutions, like you mentioned, finding solutions for your clients if you want to actually be successful in the field.
Yeah, you do. I mean, you have to, even as a sales engineer, you kind of have a quota. I mean, and you're measured against it. Now that quota is, what the salespeople that you support are supposed to sell, but you do to some degree have a quota. So you still experience, the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat in a deal, or you lose a deal. And that's part and parcel of the job itself. In terms of money, though, I mean, again, going back to your question, Hassan, is there's this perception that salespeople are coin operated, to use the phrase. And to some degree they are, but that's what you want. I mean, if you're the chief revenue officer at a tech company, you want your salespeople to be aggressively out there chasing deals, but you want them to do it, morally and ethically and everything else. Now, not to say that sales engineers don't want to get the deal done as well. And certainly as a sales engineer, you can make mostly more money than you can in most other professions, at a similar age. Right. So unless you're absolutely one of the top 1% of coders in the world, or some amazing, chem eng or mech eng, you can make more money as a sales engineer than you can in either of those professions. I mean, absolutely no question about it.
Okay.
So
yeah, definitely perks of the
yes, there is, and that's part and parcel of having sales, as it were, in your title, even though you'll normally emphasize the engineering part of it.
So, like, as a sales engineer, when let's say you're first starting off, and you just mentioned a quota, let's say
Mhm.
there comes a time where at the end of the specified time period, I don't meet that quota. Do you like get fired? How does it work? Because
Oh.
like it's a stressful situation to be in.
No. So usually the reason the reps get paid, a multiple of what sales engineers get paid is it's their necks on the line. So they are the ones who get whacked and shot first, right?
Okay.
Now, if you're doing a terrible job in discovery and horrible presentations and everything else, then there are ramifications to that as well. But normally, if say a geography doesn't make quota, very rarely will you see anything happen to any of the sales engineers unless it's truly poor performance from one of the sales engineers themselves. So your job is far safer because you have less of that risk reward ratio in your compensation.
So when speaking of like when you're first starting off in the job, when
Mhm.
you gave out your first sales pitch, like did it feel like you had more and more control over like your nerves? Because like I can like imagine how you'd be like scared at first going in presenting, and this can all just go south, and like
Yes.
a lot of ramifications can go there, especially when you're meeting a bigger client. So like how does that get better over time?
Um, Well, it does. I mean, anyone who knew me as a teenager or even at university would be stunned that I am able to get up in Vegas and talk to 3,000 people as a keynote. There's no way that's the John Kerr I knew when he was 17, right? So it is a learned skill.
Yeah.
And there are things that you can do to deal with the nerves, and it's really about channeling the nerves and the adrenaline and taking it in a positive, you know, vector as opposed to a negative one. I can share with you my very first sales call I went on, though. I mean, I was a brand new sales engineer. I knew the product really well because I'd been a user for over a year,
Mm-hmm.
but I had very little of the sales skills whatsoever.
Okay.
So I got on a sales call actually with the sales manager, not even one of the sales reps. Joel was his name. And we go on the call and I do a demo. I'm answering questions. I thought the call went really well. And we walk out into the parking lot, and Joel comes up to me. He puts his arm around me and says, "John, a word of advice." And I said, "Wow." I said, "Yeah." I thought that was a great call. He said, "John, a word of advice." He said, "Sales engineers do not get paid by the word." And that has stuck with me over 36 years, right?
Really?
Oh
Wow.
wow.
So your job is not to educate. Your job
Right.
is literally to sell and to make
Right.
the customer imagine, them using your stuff, whatever it is that you are selling. And it's not to teach them how to use every single piece of whatever
Right.
it is that you are selling.
As much as we like to talk about the
Yeah.
engineering
So
technical parts of it.
so the comfort zone of most engineers is features and technology.
Right.
And you learn that you have to understand what the business drivers are and why do people want to buy the technology, so you can better target which bits of the tech you speak about. And that's really what makes an awesome sales engineer, is being able to have that blend, that transition between the two.
Yeah, about that, by the way, I remember you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that uh, it's about like the sales engineer is basically a salesperson with a technical brain. He's the technical brain behind the operation. And then I remember you mentioned something about you've hired people who are not into engineering at all, in history
Mhm.
and all that. So if they don't have that technical background, how can they succeed in the field?
Because they have the personality and the relationship skills, right? So there's a triad. So you need the technical skills, right? You need what we call the business or the professional skills, and then you kind of need some industry skills as well. And so, unless someone's been doing the job for a number of years, you're never going to find somebody with all three. So you can go out and hire somebody. If you're a security company, you can go out and hire somebody who knows firewalls inside and out,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Antivirus programs. Um, but can they communicate? Can they ask questions of business people and uncover why somebody wants to beef up the security perimeter,
Right.
why they need to take care of a breach, whatever it is? Can they ask those questions, and can they understand how to link the business back to the technology? Um, that's not too hard to learn if you've got the right kind of brain and the attitude to do it.
Right.
So some of the best sales engineers I've ever hired have actually been people who didn't have a super technical background, had a bit more of that business background, but then able to easily make that transition over and pick up the technology and link it together.
Yeah, and it's actually it's come to light. It's pretty obvious to see now with the pandemic just how important it is being able to talk to people and being able to communicate like your feelings, whatever it is, like you might need, like to put yourself in the business's shoes who's going to be buying your product. Like I can see how that would be super important as a sales engineer, like a very great quality to have.
It is. I mean, the communication skills, and it's not even about making great presentations. I mean, one of the greatest skills a sales engineer can have is asking great questions and then shutting up and listening.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, listening is just as important as speaking, if not even more.
Yeah.
That's what I've been told over the years. Very important skill to have is to listen. But what I want to know as well is, let's say you want to sell a product that you have no like you want to present it in an engineering technical way, but you don't necessarily have that background coming from chemical engineering, John, and you have to present a product that's in a different engineering branch per se. How would you go about that? Would you ask your friends or your colleagues for help? Would you go read about it by yourself? How does that process work?
Oh, you approach it from two different ends. So one is you have to do some research about the audience that you're going to be presenting it to. Right? So are they super technical and are they going to want to dive down into the details, or are they more interested in its application and how it's going to be used and how it's going to potentially make them money, save them money, or make it a less risky environment? So you need to understand the target that you're shooting at before you figure out the weapons that you're going to be using to hit that target. So once you've figured out the target, then you go back and it depends on your learning style. So I, for example, I love to read. So I'll read things first, and then if I can watch somebody do what I need to do, that's how I'll learn. So different people have different learning styles.
Right.
And it's perfectly acceptable to sometimes be in front of the client and say, I don't know. Right? However, I'll go find out for you and I'll get you the answer within 24 hours. And as long as you don't do that more than a few times in a meeting, that's okay. I mean, there's no rule that says you have to know every single thing about your product,
right.
Because it just doesn't happen. I mean, trust me, it just doesn't unless you've been a single product person for 20 years. So
yeah, well, and I've heard that before by a few different people that say like it's okay to say you don't know as long as you are committed to actually finding the answer, which is we're all sales engineers, we're all engineers. That's kind of in our blood to figure out the solution to the problem.
You never want to be guessing in front of a client unless you actually tell them that you're what's it like, if you force me to guess, I would say.
Yeah.
But otherwise, that's that engineer thing, right? I mean, we still love facts and figures and spreadsheets and things like that.
Sure.
So you don't want to be guessing if you don't have to.
Sorry, you can go ahead.
Well, just kind of on Hassan's point. And so I've noticed you worked in pharmaceuticals, you worked in the finance industry, you worked in like software. I wonder how the sales engineering position changes when you go into like completely seemingly unrelated fields. Like I would imagine that there's certain things that remain constant for a sales engineer, even if you're indifferent.
Yeah, there are. Probably 2/3 of what you do remains constant regardless of the industry that you're selling into. And then there's the hard skill to go on top of it. So for example, I was one of the very first pre-sales managers in the verticals when Oracle got into it in 1988, right? Oracle was an $80 million company at that point.
Right.
I think I was the first pre-sales manager that Tom Siebel hired when he was starting up the verticals within Oracle. So I had to learn all about pharmaceuticals. And other than taking aspirin, I knew nothing about pharmaceuticals. So we very quickly learned about the clinical trial process, how new drug applications were made here in the US and then correspondingly around the world, adverse drug reaction systems, manufacturing, good lab practices. And then nobody from Merck or Pfizer or Glaxo expected us to be experts, but if we could at least talk their language and
Right.
talk about FDA 1639 forms for adverse drug reaction filings and things like that, their little eyes lit up because it showed that we'd actually put some work into it as well. So if you do that kind of thing, it really isn't that hard. Similarly, when I ran a good chunk of FP&I, finance, brokerage, insurance at Sybase in the mid-90s, same thing. You kind of learned about how trading systems work, the difference between the stock systems and fixed income systems, things like that. And then again, how you can apply your technology to it and what your users are doing. And it turned out, and I learned this a little bit later than I probably should have, one of the big values that you as a sales engineer have when you're in front of a client is how your product is being used by your other customers.
Right.
Both the classic uses and its off-label uses, as it were. So if you can share that with your clients, that's a major piece of value that they can't get anywhere else.
Okay.
And it's one of the reasons why even a 25-year-old sales engineer can get in the office of a 55-year-old CIO. If they can share information like that, they'll just eat it up.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a first and foremost, you really got to know everything your product can do, all the potential it has, and that's like really what the selling point comes from, I suppose.
Yeah, well, not even everything that your product can do. The major uses, I mean, the 80-20 rule comes into effect there, but also what your clients are doing with it. So if you can, without even name dropping, talk about, one of my clients is a similar size to you, had an identical problem, and what she found was, and then tell them a little 30-second conversational story. Like it does amazing things about reducing the risk profile and increasing the comfort level of the customer and your credibility.
So would you say that when you're preparing a sales pitch, because I know that, you have to prepare, you have to do all that, but there's also some level of improvisation, like where you have to improvise and tailor your presentation around someone. So like, do you do it on the spot, or do you also do your research on the person you're presenting to beforehand?
If it's a big enough sales call or it's a senior enough executive, you always want to do some research. So you go research them on the corporate website, check them out on LinkedIn. Twitter now is an awesome place to find out, what people are doing. People tend to be looser on Twitter than in practically any other environment. So they'll go a little bit more kind of outside the rails than they do on LinkedIn, for example. So do your research. Maybe you'll find some common string to pull on. Maybe I'm a big football, like soccer guy, right? So if I find someone who's a soccer coach and it's mentioned somewhere or something else, or a fellow Englishman, I know what team, and we'll start talking about that. If I'm working with someone from India, Pakistan, Australia, we'll go into cricket. So whatever I can do to find some commonality, I'm like nakedly shameless at doing that.
And it only helps you out in the long run.
Even when it comes to personal interests. So like if someone likes football, I refuse to call it soccer. Yes. Football.
Okay.
Is
good for you.
Like you would tailor that presentation to like their football interests.
Without making it blatantly so. I mean, it might be a little bit more of the social or the small talk that would go around it. I mean, so that's one way of doing it. And the other thing is, you talked about improv. You always want to have a plan. And the plan is what you fall back on. It's the guiding. So I'm a big fan of something I called RM plus 3KP. So RM stands for residual message. 3KP stands for 3 key points. Right? So RM is, you give this presentation. It's now whatever, Friday. So next Monday or Tuesday, if there's one thing you want the customer to remember about you and your presentation after they've forgotten everything else, the one thing that sticks in their brain, what is it? Right? That's your RM. Then to support that, have up to 3 key points, 3 messages that you're going to use, which kind of goes into simplicity. One of the biggest downfalls that we have as engineers is we try and shove too much into a presentation. Right? So the best presentation of all is one where you've practically pulled everything you possibly can out of it without it collapsing. So having that structure of residual message and 3 key points really, really helps you. To the point where, when my oldest daughter got married, gosh, like 4 or 5 years ago now, I was asked to give one of the introductory speeches up front. My daughter's an engineer as well, by the way, mechanical engineer, Northwestern University.
Oh, nice.
So she said, "Dad, you got 2.25 minutes to do the speech." And she's actually got a photo of me standing up there doing the welcome, and I've got 3 fingers up because I say, "Okay, there's 3 things I want to cover in the couple of minutes I have with you." So I use it in everything. But what it does, it gives me fences and it gives me structure. This is what we teach in our presentation classes. So yeah, there's always room for improv, but if you've got some guideposts and a foundation to work from, you can always fall back on that, even if the nerves are getting the best of you, because you know what's coming next.
Right. That's super interesting. Either way, I'm thinking about like going into a pitch, and it's you and your sales rep, and I'm thinking about sort of this kind of trend that we're seeing. Like if people my age are starting to get into sales engineering, we're bringing up those like sales skills along with our technical knowledge. Do you think a sales engineer can exist without a sales rep, or a sales rep without a sales engineer? Like in the future, is there like a place where those two positions are sort of combined?
Yes. They have, in certain industries, they have been separate for a while. So in some of the hard engineering aspects, a sales engineer, you're selling, like polymers or something. They are both the salesperson and the technician who explains how the polymer actually works. So that happens. Certainly in technology, when you're selling, again, hardware and software, normally there is that split, that bifurcation, and there is somebody whose main role is sales and someone whose main role is the technology/business aspects of it. Now there are overlay positions. So maybe you're a company, pick a big company like an Oracle. So Oracle have what's called overlay positions. And if there's a particular specialist product, then there's this overlay position. It's like a hybrid position. You're half sales, half pre-sales.
Right.
So you're expected to sell the product, but also know quite a bit about it. But it's a very narrow band that you're working in.
Okay.
So you see a lot of that. And that hybrid position is actually a pretty good position for a sales engineer to step into if they want to make the eventual transition into being a full-bore salesperson.
But speaking about this new generation, younger people getting into engineering, like let's say right now, people like me and Aiden, who have this new interest for sales engineering and we're graduating very soon. And now with this unexpected year that was 2020, to say the least, with the pandemic, how has the field of sales engineering, do you believe it can still function the way it used to? Does it function better? Is it worse in this more remote working kind of environment?
Sure. I don't know if it functions better. It functions differently. And I think sales engineers actually were one of the very first professions or job roles to adapt to it, I think, faster than anybody else.
Yeah.
Even in an enterprise field sales organization, pick a Salesforce.com or something, their top level sales engineers, probably at least 40% of their interactions here in the Americas were done virtually. That number was a little bit lower in EMEA and a little bit lower still in APAC, but there was already a considerable amount of customer interaction done, the way that we're conversing now.
Right.
So it's just a matter of stepping that up and converting it, from 40% almost to 100% for SEs to do that. So I think actually the sales engineers adapted much quicker than the reps did, and much faster than the customers did.
Yeah.
To the point, I saw sales engineers who were giving unofficial Zoom classes to their clients.
Yeah, well, like it's interesting to me. Like, have you found? So clients are having a hard time to get all online and to get remote. Is it more difficult to sort of establish that relationship and sympathize and relate to like customers if the only like way you can communicate with them is over a screen? Like, do you find like would sales engineering kind of suffer in that, or any sales, I guess, for that matter, suffer in that sort of regard where you don't actually get to see them in person and shake their hand? And
yeah, Yeah, I think that's a basic function of humanity. Is you want to be close to people and touch
Yeah.
them and sit down and have coffee, beer,
Yeah.
and everything else.
Yeah.
I always say that food and drink are the universal solvent of relationships, which is
I might have to
absolutely
quote you
true.
on that. Yeah.
Preach,
Yeah, which is
preach.
actually true in sales and in pre-sales.
Yeah.
So that's certainly something that we miss. And there are clients of mine who have coffee hours with their clients. They have wine tasting afterwards. Internal SE organizations kind of get together, but I mean, after a while, it's kind of wearing, right? And there's this Zoom gloom phrase, and this
Yeah.
I forget what
Zoom
it is, but
gloom.
Google Meet.
Feeling the Zoom gloom right now.
Yeah, I mean, so we got to the holidays, and a lot of people are like, and it's
Yeah.
downtime.
Yeah.
And then within a week of getting into January, people are like fatigued again. I mean, it's hard work
Yeah.
doing this
Yeah.
the way it is,
Yeah.
and you
Absolutely.
don't get that, just the physical interaction, and even all the nonverbal cues. Like right now, I can
Yeah.
see your upper bodies and your
Yeah.
face. I have
Yeah.
no idea what the rest of you are doing, what your posture are in the chairs or
Hmm.
anything like that. So I'm missing some of those clues,
Hmm.
and particularly for people in my generation. I mean, even down to Gen Y, the way that we're used to operating. So
Hmm.
it's I think there's a
That's
relation to age as well in there.
that's super interesting that you brought that up, because I've always kind of been interested in like body language and people, how they're sort of feeling, and you can always sort of tell just by what they're not saying and the things that they're doing with
Uh-huh.
their. And it's interesting that you brought, it's kind of a change of pace from what you're talking about, but it's interesting that you brought that up, like how good have you gotten at reading body language? How important is it? I would imagine it's super important, but like to even see like where their feet are pointing or what they're like, how they're acting, it's
Yeah,
I find it
it
super
is. I mean, I have a friend who's a manager at Starbucks, the coffee store, right? And one of the issues they have is the non-verbal communications with customers, because how do you see someone smile when they've got
right.
a mask?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, did you see like the little pinches on the face and
The
everything?
eyebrows.
So
The eyebrows that go up.
yeah, well, that's what they teach them. They teach us to exaggerate facial expressions
Okay.
now, and
Yeah.
move. It's
Okay.
so you kind of have to do the same thing as a sales engineer.
Mhm.
So certainly, at least the last 20 years, I've been pretty animated when I speak, and I wave my hands around a
Yeah.
lot, which is
Yeah.
unusual for an Englishman. But I've learned that. But in the Zoom world, you have to do it
Yeah.
even more, because you have to show the passion and the energy and the enthusiasm,
Yeah.
and drive that home over this mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I can imagine.
Exactly. Like, to go off on Aiden's very excellent question, his point that he brought up. It's that, okay, like, we might not be engineers, but even as students, we still feel that, to quote you, Zoom gloom, where you feel like a week into January already, and it already feels like the end of the semester already in terms of like fatigue. And it's just
Yeah.
that, I do agree that people right now need to put in more passion if they want to keep the attentions, like whether it's us students or even professors. But yeah, that's it's certainly a problem that's right now that's very big in society in general. I completely
It,
agree.
it is. I mean, I talk to our facilitators around the world who deliver all the classes. And 2019 and before that, at the end of the day, they'd say, my feet are a little sore, right? I need to change my shoes. But it was a little bit of physical tiredness. Now
Mhm.
you deliver these classes, and it's
You're
mental
just like,
tiredness, and
oh.
it's actually harder. I mean, I think it takes a bigger toll on the human body,
Yeah.
than the physical tiredness
Yeah.
does.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel so awful for, like, I'm sitting in my lectures and watching the teacher trying to present, and some teachers are obviously better
Uh,
at working a class and presenting than others, but like just a bunch of either black screens or blank faces, like really no emotion in it at all. And it's hard on the student, it's hard on the professor. It's just not a trying to make the best of it, I suppose, but I don't really know where you go.
it is, and yeah, there's studies, right? So if you if you have video on, it's whatever 64% better engagement and 72% better retention and things like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, but you've got to convince people to have the video on in the first place.
Yeah, 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 exactly.
Yeah, no, that's for sure.
Um,
I was wondering, like, we've talked about all your great experiences, but if I had to tell you, like, what is a like, have you ever had an incident where you had a bad pitch, a bad incident, and how was it? Like, was it the customer that was like too nitpicky, or the client, I mean, sorry, or like, I don't know, like, are there like, can you describe a bad day for you in terms of like a
Oh,
sales pitch?
sure. I mean, anybody who's been in this job for more than about 6 months and tells you they haven't had a bad call is lying to you.
Yeah.
No question about it. So, I mean, if I look back to being an SE manager, whatever, that there's calls that I went on where the demo failed.
Oh
It's just a
no.
complete technology crash. And yeah, you can blame it on Microsoft or Apple, but ultimately that's your responsibility as
Yeah.
the sales engineer. There's where you completely misread the client,
Okay.
and you're pitching product A, and they wanted to see product B, or you tell them about some use for it, and they don't want that use because it means that they're going to get rid of half the department because they're going to get automated. So they're never going to buy it. So there's stuff like that. Probably the worst client call I ever went on was when we were making so when I worked at Oracle, we were making a pitch, and this guy at the back of the room stood up and said to us, "You're lying." Said,
Oh
"That's
no.
not true. If IBM can't do it, Oracle can't do it," and just accused us of lying.
Okay.
And I had never been in that situation before, and I was the
Yeah,
manager at the
sure.
time, and I look at my poor sales engineer, and he's absolutely stunned. The rep's kind of looking around, wondering what to do, and then
Yeah.
fortunately, this rep Bruce kind of came to his senses and just slammed his notebook shut and said, "That's it, we're done." He said, "Come on, pack up," and we
Wow.
just walked out. We walked out into the parking lot, and he said, "Okay, now we're going to wait." I said, "Let's just go home, Bruce. It's a miserable day." I said, no, we're going to wait. And lo and behold, about 3 or 4 minutes later, the purchasing agent comes running out into the parking lot and says, no, you got to come back in. And Bruce says, no, we're not going back in. That was just insulting, totally unprofessional. He says, no, you got to come back in. Like, we really want to hear from you. And Bruce says, okay, well, we're only going to come back in if that guy at the back of the room stands up, apologizes to John and Joel, like my sales engineer, and then I want him out of the room.
Wow.
And he said,
Like
okay,
straight
we
out
can
of a
do that.
movie or something.
Yeah. And so we went back in, we did it. And lo and behold, about 2 months later, we actually got the deal. We beat IBM for the deal.
Wow.
But
Wow.
I have never been in that kind of situation before. But yeah, I have made plenty of dumbass mistakes. I've seen plenty of dumbass mistakes from salespeople and sales engineers alike, and root
Right.
and everything else. So it's actually part of the job, and you laugh about it afterwards because it's experience, and
Mm.
you
Yeah,
you
of
learn
course.
from it,
Mhm.
and you adapt for it next time.
Yeah.
So
Well, so I was gonna ask, so like, let's say you have a just awful, embarrassing pitch. How do you regroup and go to the next sales pitch, and what do you like? I don't know. I can imagine it can be traumatizing for some people. And what would you tell them?
uh, it's so when they interview coaches at a game, and they ask them, how do you see the rest of the season? He says, well, I'm just going to take it one game at a time.
Right.
That
Yes.
cliche.
Yeah.
That's where it's important.
Mm.
And you can't have a memory. It's
Yeah.
like being a goalkeeper and you let in 5 goals.
Right.
Right? Well, do you remember that next time? Well, no. I mean, otherwise you're never going to do it. So you start fresh. Now, do you go back and analyze? I'm a big fan of something called T3, B3, N3. So T3 is top three, right? So what are the top three things I did that I should repeat and do next time? B3 are what are the bottom three things I did that I should never ever do again?
Okay.
And then N3 are what are the next three things, which is what are three things I never even thought about doing that maybe I should adapt or include in it. So I'll make that list. I'll get that list from the rep who was on the call with me or anybody else in the room. And that's my way of getting feedback. And then I'll take that and I'll adapt. Now, you can't adapt too radically. I mean, you still need to be your authentic self,
Right.
and that's an overused word, authenticity. But I mean, you still need to be you, right? You can't try and be somebody else,
Mm.
but you can certainly adapt the way that you're interacting with a client.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's what you got to do. If you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes, but it's painful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Uh, but I just wanted to ask, like, after all those experiences that you've been through, working for Oracle and all those big companies, what like at what point and why did you decide to be like, I want to open up my own company now. I want to teach, like give my experiences to others.
Mhm.
Like,
I,
sorry.
I just thought there was nothing in the market. I mean, no one was really doing this kind of training. I mean, there were a couple of companies out there that taught you how to do a demo or something, but that was about it. But
Okay.
nobody taught you about all the things that happened before the demo. And nobody taught you about all the things that happened after the demo. And the demo is not the be all and end all of being a sales engineer, even though a few people think it is. Um, and so that just encouraged me. You know what? Let's just start up a company and monetize the
See.
content of the book, because the
Mhm.
book was selling pretty well. So
Mm.
people liked it. So
Yeah.
let's turn it into courseware. And somebody decided they were going to pay me some money to do it. And then somebody decided they're going to pay me some more money to do it. And then someone asked me to build a specific custom class for them. And it
Okay.
just rolled.
Just
It
sort
just
of brought
rolled
itself
after that.
together. Mhm.
And I think the ultimate momentum for it actually came from my lovely wife. And it got to the point where she looked at me and literally kind of like slapped me around the back of the head and said, "Just start up the damn business, will you? Because if you don't, you'll die a grumpy old man, and I'll have to live with you. So I have confidence in you. If it doesn't work for a year or two, we have enough in the bank that we'll survive.
Right.
Just go do it." And
Mhm.
so I had the power of Allison behind me, pushing me to do this, and I think that made a lot of difference to me as well. So, and then here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. The rest is history, as they say, I
But
guess.
yeah, so in the old days, I'd be traveling, 150,000 miles a year, and
Okay.
hanging out in Sydney and Singapore and Amsterdam and London and cool places like that. And instead, I'm in Longboat Key, Florida, so that's not too bad. But I do miss some of the travel and getting in
Hmm.
front of customers.
Hmm.
So pre-pandemic,
Uh-huh.
what was a typical work day like for you? Like as like right now, like let's say 2019.
Um, so it would vary. Describe it maybe a typical work month. So I would normally try and work, actually be in front of clients maybe 2 days a week. I'm either delivering a class or doing some consulting work or something like that. And the other 3 days, I'd be building content, working on paperwork, or if I was traveling, just kind of having some fun.
Right.
So we ended up, and this makes the job sound like amazingly good, but I think it is that we take opportunistic vacations. So there was one point where I had to work in Singapore for a week, and so I was delivering classes for 2 clients in Singapore. And my wife looks at me and says, "So is Australia on the way to Singapore?" Because I'd been to Oz a few times and she hadn't. And I said, "Well, no, honey, but it can be." So we spent 10 days in Australia before I went up to Singapore and worked. I mean,
Mhm.
so that killed my profit margin for the trip. But that was the job. And it's the benefit of running your own business is I can do stuff like that.
Right.
And I actually encourage my facilitators to do that as well. So
Mhm.
it's a mixture to go back. It's a mixture of delivering classes, preparing new content, speaking with customers, and generally having fun.
Sounds pretty good deal to me, actually.
Well, that's why I said
um,
I truly believe I have one of the best jobs in the world,
yeah.
and being a sales engineer is one of the best jobs in the world too, if you choose to make it so.
Right. Yeah.
So
Um,
just to like, if you had to give advice to people
Mhm.
like me and Aiden, uh, about who don't know, like, or people who don't know about sales engineering at all,
Right.
or who are just getting into the field, what advice would you give them?
So what the advice would be, is this really something you want to do? Right. So do you like solving problems? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, no. Do you like actually dealing with people? All right. If you'd rather deal with code and laptops and technology rather than people, it's probably not the job for you. So if you like dealing with people, making people happy, if you have somewhat of a competitive streak in you, so you want to win as opposed to lose, and you could say most people do that, but it needs to be stronger in a sales engineer.
mhm.
That's probably a good thing to have as an SE. And then it's really about attitude. And the last piece of advice is don't make it all about the technology. Um, one of the biggest hiring points for a young or potential young sales engineer is if you can take the technology and if you can map it back to solving business problems, right? So if you can take the tech and you can explain to the prospect how it's either going to help them make more money, how it's going to help them save money, or how it's going to make them operate in a less risky environment, either corporately or personally, that's how you get the deal. So making that linkage between the features and the technology and the end benefits and the outcomes is vitally important. And so many young engineers just get wrapped around the features and the technology, and then let me show you one more menu item, and you don't talk about the outcomes and the benefits. And if you can make that transition, you're halfway there.
Yeah. And I guess to that point, you're at the end of the day, you're selling to people. You're not selling to technology. You need to really bring that sort of human aspect into it.
Well, at least not yet, right?
Not yet.
Maybe in 10 years, AI will be buying from tech companies.
I guess then this job would go void, I guess, in that.
I think SEs are safe for about at least another 20 years. So salespeople, maybe not so much, but SEs are.
Yeah. A question I have is, I guess you would probably know better than anybody, just seeing the trend that this sort of field is going. What does the future of sales engineering look like to you? Where would you like it to go? Like where like in whatever 15 years you see the sales engineering field as it is? What is it in your head?
Well, if history is a guide, it's going to change and expand quite a bit. So 20 years ago, probably the number one skill that customers wanted from sales engineers was somebody with deep technical knowledge.
Right.
That was again .com boom, right? Ancient history for both of you, but not for me. Now, what customers want is, I want someone who understands my business. I want someone who can develop innovative solutions with my staff. I want someone who can clearly and effectively communicate with me, and I want somebody I can trust to do the right thing for me and my business. Then it's deep technical knowledge, right? So that's what mid to senior level execs want from sales engineers. So where I'm going with this is the role has really become far more consultative and even a little bit more salesy than it was, a decade or two ago. And I think that's going to continue. So yeah, if you work for a small startup and there's 2 sales engineers there, then you have to be super deep in the weeds techie. If you're working for a somewhat larger company, whether it's software, hardware, classic engineering, maybe not necessarily so much. In the application of technology itself, the low end part of the job is going to be automated. So things like responding to RFPs, basic out of the box demos, simple discovery calls and scripts, they're all going to be automated so that we as SEs can focus what I think is the fun part of the job, which is the architectural design, the solution design, and the customer interaction. And then lastly, maybe technology. Again, AI and ML become part of that. So there'll be, I have customers now who have bots that manage proof of concept setups up in the cloud. And the bots look at it and they only notify the sales engineer if the customer is doing something weird with it.
Okay.
So that's a great application of AI and ML. Holographic technology, sensory technology, that's going to come into play big time with demos. So demos are going to be far more of experiential and sensory experience for the customer. They're not just going to be sitting at a screen watching something.
Right.
So that those are all cool things as well. I think will come.
It's funny that you mentioned. I don't want to actually take too much of your time. I know that we're bordering on an hour here, but it's funny that you brought up like an automated process for responding to RFPs, and I guess for people who aren't really familiar with it, it's request for proposal, right?
Yes.
I was in a meeting with the NAASE, which is like an association of sales engineers around North America. And they're meant, like, a question I had for them is sort of deciphering between like proposals that are serious or not so serious. And if that process goes automated, how can like AI decide, like, I'm not sure if you have any experience with it, but how can AI decide if a proposal is something that a sales engineer should pursue, or if it's like,
we've been doing that manually with Excel spreadsheets for 15, 20 years.
Right.
Actually in the book, there's a chapter about RFPs and there's a little Excel spreadsheet at the end. And if you fill it out, a score jumps out.
Okay.
Basically, it says if the score is less than 40, just like throw it back in the water.
just say no, thank you.
If the score is higher than 70, absolutely do it.
Okay.
And if the score is between 40 and 70, then you and the rep and the rest of the sales team, you need to exercise judgment and figure out if you should do it or not.
Right. Okay.
So there is a way of doing it as long as you get some objective and honest input into the process itself, and that's been around for a while.
Right.
So that's pretty easy to automate, I think,
Okay.
based on where a request for proposal or a request for information comes in. And there's companies that have been automating this for a while now. So
okay, I didn't know. Yeah, so like the one person I had spoken to is because they were saying that it took so much time to actually go through all the things that a potential client was asking for. So that's good to know.
We joke that RFP stands for really fast paperwork.
I know we're also running out of time, but I just have one question that I really, really want to ask you.
Sure.
And it's, you mentioned about
the Chiefs will beat the Browns. No, that's not it. Okay.
No, not that. I just want football. We could talk all about football later for sure. Okay. But what I wanted to know is, you said that in 20 years, like sales engineers are good for another 20 years. Uh-huh. And I'm a personally who's very interested about tech and artificial intelligence and whatnot. But do you believe that artificial intelligence will be able to replace us from now to 20 years?
I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
It depends if AI can get past, the Turing point, right? So can you actually determine if, the entity on the other end of the internet is actually a real person or a computer? Once you get to the point where you can't tell, which, is the Turing point in good old science fiction, things might change. I still remain to be convinced that AI and ML can do some of the amazing kind of just mental leaps that sales engineers can do in terms of, let's do this. My generation calls it MacGyvering, right? You just get WD-40 duct tape and a penknife and you fix it. Can AI and ML do that? I don't know. But SEs will be around longer than salespeople. And what the world's going to look like in 2041, I have no idea. I don't think anybody can predict that. What I do know is that customers find that sales engineers provide the most value to them and their organization than anyone else in the vendor environment. So as long as your customers feel that way, I think we're pretty safe.
Yeah.
In the words of a football coach, we take it one game at a time, or 1 year at a time in this case. So yes, just to conclude this episode, thank you very much, John, for being here. Honestly, it's been an honor meeting you. And thank you, Aiden, for being my co-host for this episode. You've been
absolutely. And John, we'll be seeing you, I guess, January 27th. I think we're going to be doing a workshop with you. Super excited for that.
Yeah, I think it's in February. Well, we'll figure out the date.
Sorry. Yes, I got the wrong.
Yeah, no, for some other guy. Yeah, yeah. So I'm running a couple little mini workshops for you. I think next month. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited for that.
We'll teach you how to become the fabulous sales engineer.
Excellent.
I know I speak for the whole team when I say that I am very excited for those workshops. That's for sure.
Awesome. So, me too. I learned stuff from you folks as well. So it's the privilege of working with the young'uns, as my dad would say.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Technically speaking, more episodes coming soon. We're just getting started.